Great to be here this morning. I traveled over from the U.S. yesterday. Lots of exciting things going on in the U.S., but I don't think it's any less in Europe with excitement there. So we're in fun times, lots of action going on. Good time to think about improvement as a general strategy and philosophy. The theme today that Darius asked me to talk about was time, and so much to do, so little time. And I think I had my lesson in time when my daughter was 4 years old, and I was complaining one day about I didn't have time to do all the things that I wanted to do, and she pointed out that I had the same amount of time as she did. We all have the same time, and so nobody has a problem with time. So just don't hear that. Dad, quit complaining about that. Okay, so what is it? What we're talking about is what do we want to do with our time, and how do we proportion it? What are our priorities, the choices that we want to make with our time? And I think if we think about improvement and the choices we want to make there, which of the things that we're involved in are leading to patients' benefits? That's a pretty good theme to think about as a general prioritization as we try to do our time. And it has lots of implications on, how do we know if what we're doing actually benefits patients. So the idea of time, I read an interesting story, and one of my colleagues wrote an article. Has anybody ever seen this clock at Oxford? It's supposedly a pretty exciting thing. In 2008, this time-eating clock was unveiled at Corpus Christi College in Cambridge. Sitting atop the clock is a chronophage, a large grasshopper-looking escapement that eats up every minute of your life, and as soon as he's gone, he's salivating for the next. Do that. Doesn't that sound nice? Literally, the name that the developer of this timepiece gave to him comes from the Greek, and it means time eater, to do this. And as you look at this clock, this grasshopper moves its mouth, constantly appearing to eat up the seconds as they pass. And occasionally it blinks in seemingly satisfaction. The creature's constant motion produces an eerie grinding sound that suits its task. And then once an hour, that is told by the sound of a chain clanking in a small wooden coffin hidden in the back of the clock. Okay? Doesn't that sound pleasant and exciting to do that at the time? This was really originally conceived as a work of public art. The chronophage reminds viewers in a dramatic way of the inevitable passing of time. The designer, John C. Taylor, deliberately designed it to be terrifying. Others have described it as hypnotically beautiful and deeply disturbing. So as we reflect on this, two of my colleagues, Bob Lloyd and Don Goldman, wrote a paper in JAMA a couple years ago. Healthcare time is certainly not protected from this voracious appetite of the chronophage. But the passage of time in any medical situation is perceived in different ways depending on who's doing the watching to do that. Paul Batalden reported out a number of times, and it was an article he wrote on what is quality improvement a number of years ago, that everyone in healthcare has two jobs when they come to work: to do their work and to improve it. This is the essence of quality improvement. Now, some other industries try to say that this is true, that when you come, you have two jobs, but in a lot of cases, it's not true. The people that work there don't have two jobs. They have the one job, which is their work, and that's it. But a lot of industries and those that have taken a philosophy of quality improvement have created that second job. And Paul made it clear in this article that healthcare is not a choice, it's an obligation. As clinicians, we practice, and the practice leads to learning, and the learning needs to lead to improvement. So that we all have two jobs. So one thing to think about is our time as we set our priorities. How much time tomorrow am I going to spend on my work, and how much am I going to spend on improvement? And I think those of us that are in healthcare, that's something we need to think about and do that allocation every day, because we have those two jobs. What do we do in quality improvement? We've tried to build frameworks that allow us to minimize our time and get the maximum benefit. We focus on particular problems. The model of improvement helps us develop an aim, measurement strategy, and a theory. And then we have a methodology called Plan, Do, Study, Act that allows us to work very quickly and rapidly at a very small scale, do follow-up on the things that work and make a difference, and then eventually do widespread testing over a longer time to allow us to see, does this really work in our system? And then lastly, not initially now, work on hardwiring that in our system, implement that and make it a permanent part of our process. So the model for improvement is a framework for quality improvement designed to maximize our time and to spend a minimal amount of time early on when our theories are weak and our lack of understanding, and do our maximum time as we get close to making this a permanent part of our system, our optimization. The problem, though, as we look at this picture, most quality improvement efforts I've seen looking at some of the storyboards out there, there's not just one idea that we go through a ramp on. There's a whole series of ideas. And so somehow we have to learn to work these in parallel and take care of the synergies that are going on between the different changes that we're making in our systems at the same time. So we have a framework that allows us to think about time, and always one of the most important questions when we're in a team meeting or we're working on our own is, what's the scope of our next Pdsa cycle? How long am I going to spend on that Pdsa cycle? Now, you know, we have these two jobs. Think about what you're doing tomorrow. What you could be doing tomorrow is the bottom row, and that's a lot of work. And that's going to take a long time. And in fact, you might have a tendency, if you've got enough of those rocks to deliver, is not to be willing to spend a little time and think about improvement and look for other ideas and ways to do this. So a lot of us get locked in to the current way we're doing this. I just read an interesting poster out there that's looking at can we do some video consults, Skype time, instead of all face-to-face visit in primary care. And this concept was waved in front of all the primary care, and 82% said we're too busy to no thanks, but 18% took it up and are looking at the will to do that. So how do we work to get better, to get people's attention so that they realize, and they're bogged down by their doing the work there, to invest some time and look around and say, how do we do that? So I want to talk about 4 ways that I think that we can be useful in different ways of helping us think about where do we find this time for improvement? How do we invest that? First one is setting a rhythm for improvement. So we have some type of pattern going on in our lives. Second is a framework one of the IHI fellows worked on called highly adoptable improvement. Third is the concept of orchestrated testing. And then the fourth is a concept Maureen Bissanoga, IHI CEO, talked about exnovation and undiffusion. 2 new concepts. You've probably heard something close to those, but not those. So the first is setting this rhythm for improvement. Okay? As we think about, I want to run Pdsas. That's the scientific method. That's quality improvement that allows me to apply that on a day-to-day basis to my work and to my projects there. So what's my natural cycle? How often should I be doing a Pdsa? When's my opportunity to do the planning? When's the opportunity to do the study, to stop and pause and reflect on what we've learned? And then when do I actually get to act on what I've learned there? So it's useful to go look in our work and say, what is a natural pattern that we can build that improvement in? So if I look at an operating room and I look at today's schedule, that's certainly a nice opportunity to do planning. Okay, given this schedule of surgeries today, what are my opportunities? What questions do I have? What are opportunities to test those and learn about those? When I have a weekly clinic, so we meet once a week, so there's plenty of time. I've got 6 days to plan for the next clinic there. And then I need to do the study probably maybe immediately after that clinic so we can try our new ideas. A shift change from working on safety and flow is an opportunity to reflect. What do we plan to learn? What do we actually learn? And then as we reflect on it, pass that on to the next shift to do that. End of the day in primary care, when we look at here's tomorrow's schedule, what did we learn today? What do we need to test there? Do that. Sometimes it can be every patient visit. If I'm a specialist and I'm working on cases there, what was unique here? There should be maybe a time for at least the study portion, and then starting to put together a plan for the next series of Pdsas after each visit. And certainly when we make, if we do multidisciplinary rounding in the wards, after a rounding there, we have a good time to stop and do the study and put some plans and act there. So what is a natural cycle in your work there? Where's a good time for the components of Pdsa to fit in? One concept that people have used in setting aims and setting targets has been the half-life concept. And this came from work in industry. The half-life concept focuses on, I've got a problem I'm working on. How much should I be able to expect? Can I expect that problem to go away in a month, a year, or a day? What's a reasonable expectant? And the half-life is the length of time it takes to reduce the defects or close the gap by 50%. So half-life is appealing in that it accommodates the notion of perfection. I'm trying to get perfection, yet it accepts that in any finite time, I'm not going to get to perfection there. The ultimate endpoint in a particular process is 0 for perfection. We would set the goal at a time it takes us to achieve a 50% reduction. If we're trying to eliminate harm from a particular drug and the current rate is 2% harm, then the half-life would be how long is it going to take it to get to 1%? So that's the basic concept. Now, other industries have studied that. So they've looked at their problems across their industries and measured that and kept track of their rate of improvement there. The first one is working on computer chips there, and they're looking at the aluminum smears in the test pads. Okay, how long does it take us to reduce that? And so their half-life was 2.4 months. So they, in 2.4 months, they're able to cut it in half. And then the next 2 points, cut it in half again, cut it in half again. Eastman Kodak, looking at one of their defects in one of their products there, their half-life was a little over 7 months. And then we get down some longer absenteeism, and Japan Steelworks in Japan, their half-life was 14.8 months, so over a year to cut it in half there. And then IBM working on quality improvement with their vendors, their half-life was 21.6, almost 2 years. So we see that different types of problems we can learn will have different half-lives we're working on. So I think it's a nice model for healthcare to think about for the various types of problems we have, not just in NHS, but around the world in healthcare. How long does it take to cut that problem in half? And it's a good goal to think about. One of a collaborative in the United States working on IBD, trying to get patients in remission. And they started working together. There was about 12 sites. Today there's over 75 care centers that are working together. And they've gone in this time from 2005, 2009, from a remission rate of just over around 50%. Now they've got it to 79%. And when they started off, their thoughts, all the experts, the theoretical maximum would be 80%. You can never get more than 80% of these patients. Today, they don't think that anymore. They think well, they're starting to think 100%. Why shouldn't every patient be in remission? And so they can think that. But you can see how they've cut that gap in half at different time periods as they've moved ahead there. And so they're thinking of that half-life. They have the overall goal of how we can get all patients in remission now. And how long, what are we doing? How long does it take to do it? So the half-life can offer an effective framework for long-term planning. So we think about our various problems in healthcare and think about what projects should we take on, where should we set our priorities there. One thing, so in your personal work that you're working on, how many cycles is it going to take to get to 99% performance in there? Where am I now? What's the half-life? How many Pdsa cycles is it going to take to get there? So this is one way to set our goals, and we can promise our patients we're working on perfection, but then we can be very realistic and not frustrated time-wise on what it takes there. We can actually understand that there is that natural pattern there. Try to certainly encourage you to consider that as we set our goals and aims and targets for improvement. In The Toyota Way, Jeffrey Leiker was an author that spent time as a Toyota manager, wrote about his experiences in this book. It's a very good book. Anybody who's practiced lean realizes there's more than just tools and methods behind lean. There's an important philosophy there. Leiker talks about time in the book there. He said, I believe the key to making time for improvement is equivalent to leveling the workload. So we all know if we have a whole bunch of arrivals in ED at 9 in the morning and then not many at noon. How do we learn to level that workload? How do we shape the demand to do that? So what he suggests is let's think about improvement the same way. How can we actually level the workload of improvement? So I don't do any improvement on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. I spend 2 hours. Well, that's not level. That's big jumps there to do that. And his answer is smooth it out and do a little bit every day. Even 15 minutes of work every day with appropriate coaching can be very effective for improvement. In fact, based on how people learn, 15 minutes a day for 5 days is far more efficacious than 75 minutes once per week, which is far more effective for learning than a 1 week Kaizen blast once a quarter to do that. Okay? So he's saying instead of just the big improvement events, how do I take that time in the event and divide it by the number of days and try to begin to level that workload improvement? Now, some individuals will have a much larger role in improvement, and thus they have to spend more hours at times, like an engineer or maintenance person or the leader of the team there to do it. And at some point, someone responsible for specific projects will need to work overtime. But this is something not everybody in the team has to do there. Okay? So as I think about it, the leader of the team is how can you learn to level the workload for the participants in the team? And so they get into that rhythm, natural rhythm of spending a small time every day thinking about improvement and not just the one big event. One practice a number of teams have used in the U.S. is instead of team meetings, they have team huddles. So instead of a 2-hour meeting once a week, they have a 15-minute huddle every day to talk about their Pdsa's and update. And then the team leader and maybe 1 or 2 others will have a special meeting to pull all that together once a week and then keep everybody involved through the huddles. One of my colleagues, Chris Hayes, was a Harkness Fellow at IHI a number of years ago, and he developed a project which he called Highly Adoptable Improvement. And I think it has an important thought about time relative to improvement there. It's a model and a tool actually to address workload capacity balance. So it fits with the idea of CLAHRC and balancing our workload with perceived value amongst quality improvement projects there. So he has a website, which I referenced here. You can actually use this tool now. You can look at a quality improvement project, apply this tool, and says, do I have highly adoptable improvement to do that? So here was his premise. His background is we have increasing demands to improve quality. We have a whole lot of new increasing change initiatives coming to our point of care, all the safety initiatives that are going on, flow initiatives, patient satisfaction initiatives. We have all those coming to us in our care process there. And in the environment, many of these initiatives fail. Many of these aren't successful. They don't make it and become successfully implemented. We report change fatigue due to the volume, number of projects I'm being asked to do, the associated workload. Improvements require additional work, but I'm not given additional capacity in the job. Lack of involvement of everybody that's connected and the lack of perceived value. That's some of the excuses that we have for not making it successful. So what Chris did is look at a number of successful initiatives and started thinking about what is their impact on time. Okay, so when we developed the ventilator-associated bundle, we had great success at reducing VAP across ICUs, across first the United States and in the world to do that. But the long-term impact now, we have reduced VAP, we've added 2 hours per day of direct nursing time, and we've affected some other activities. Okay? So that bundle didn't come free to do that. We've actually has additional tasks that weren't done before that bundle, and they're done now. So who's dealt with that 2 hours in all their planning and in staffing and so forth there? Intensive blood glucose monitoring, 2 hours per day direct nursing time additional. Electronic medical record has actually created longer work days, documentation there, seeing fewer patients and disrupted workflows as we introduced those initially. Surgical safety checklist has only added about 1.5 minutes per case to do this, and has actually had a pretty good direction in delays in surgeries. People have done that. Each of these has some references there. And then the central line infection bundle, another change there, affect ICUs. The key there was having things organized in a cart. Until we did that, there were a lot of delays. We couldn't plan it, but now it can be built right into the workflow without additional work. Mary Dixon Woods wrote a paper that talked about that. Those that had sustained it had all done something different, how they've changed the cart where their instruments and everything were laid out. So I think the point here is not these 4 initiatives or anything, but every improvement initiative that we work on there, we successfully implemented. What was our impact on the organization's time? And who dealt with that impact and adjusted the schedules and the balanced workload relative to that time? And that's what Chris is thinking about, okay? And his hypothesis was this, is that we do something and some things actually, while we're doing the testing, add some change, but then long-term there's no impact. Other things leave more workload. In other projects, we actually can take workload away. So which one of these is the project you're working on now doing there? And then what are we going to do with that? If we've done the bottom one, what happens to this extra time? How do we manage that? Okay? And so these were some of the examples there. So Chris's hypothesis was this, that if I start a change initiatives that does not have high additional workload and has high perceived value, those are more likely to be adopted. Those will have success and not to waste. And it also will cause less workplace burden and achieve the intended outcomes because of that. Okay? So how could I look at my improvement initiative and understand what is its impact, what is its perceived value, and what's its impact on workload? So adding that dimension. He looks at the situation right now where we end up, because of throwing new improvement interventions on and that require more load or with no capacity, is we end up with burnout, change fatigue, cynicism, error and workload, and then we don't end up getting the constants we have. So we're in this negative loop, and what he wants to create by use his model, think through this ahead of time, is let's think about focusing on adopting sustainable improvement interventions. If we do have something that is going to add 2 hours, let's deal with that up front, make it very explicit, and talk about how are we getting those 2 hours all the way through, and maybe not move it to implementation until we get there. And then we do get the intended. So how do we turn this negative feedback loop into a positive feedback loop? And that's what his framework is all about. So he has a model that allows us to look at various components of our project, and actually rated here to come up with actually a rating of does this look like it's going to be adoptable? Is your initiative we have right now? And then also gives us a chance to think through and maybe change that. So in summary, the highly adoptable improvement model, efforts to improve healthcare can increase workload. We need to understand that. The VAP bundle, great. We got rid of VAPs, and there's tremendous cost savings from that, but there is some additional workload. How was that managed there? The highly adoptable improvement model and the guide that follows that supports focusing on impact of our change on end users and is proving useful. It's been active on the website now for about 3 years, raising awareness of the factors that affect your adoption rate, assessing the likelihood of success of our quality improvement project at the beginning, and then the potential, how could I redesign my change initiative to make it more sustainably adoptable and fit in there to do that. Those of you that use the music framework for quality improvement projects, a lot of Chris's thinking came from that framework, but he's looking directly at the time involved, the workload involved in our projects there. Okay. So, next idea is, how can I share some of the workload? Okay? If my improvement project actually involves 4 different concepts that needs to be studied, adapted, and fit into our situation and shown whether they'll work or not to do that, that's a lot of work for me. Can I get somebody to help? And one method that we found very useful recently is called orchestrated testing. And orchestrated testing is we're going to coordinate our testing to evaluate ideas for improvement. I'm going to get others involved with me. Okay? We wrote a couple articles with some results, but then also a paper on the approach, which is basically taking factorial design thinking and applying it to improvement projects. So here's one that was done as part of the Improved Care Network. We wanted to put in place as general practice in our clinics, pre-visit planning, population management, and accelerated self-management support for our patients there. Okay, so each of those is a lot of work. How can we learn about how to adapt each of these to the clinic setting, make it work, and show that it gets results? Well, one way is to do a factorial design with 3 interventions. That's 8 different combinations. Well, let's ask all our sites, like our 70 participating sites, to volunteer to be in one of these 8 here. It's not hard to find volunteers for group 1. What does group 1 have to do? It's minus, minus, minus. They have to just sit there. That's our control group. Okay? It's hard to find them for group 8. Group 8 has to do all 3 interventions to do that, interventions at a time. So we look at look at who has the time, who has the energy, who has the passion, and get ourselves in an appropriate site. And we get a implementation package where each of these have been evaluated. We understand its impact individually. We understand synergy interactions between the sites there. So the benefits of this orchestrated testing, rather than just go out on my own and plug through this, is it reduces my individual time for improvement. I'm going to let 7 others, I'm going to learn 1/8, and I'm going to let others learn the 7/8 and then teach me. Also increases the power for learning. We can get larger sample sizes very quickly, especially if we're working on a rare event and I only see 10 of these patients a month. Well, all of a sudden my other sites, we're up to 80, 100 patients a month there. It allows us to test multiple changes at the same time so we can understand interactions. We can get a potentially better intervention design because we have to do a better job if we're going to do it at 8 different places of describing the intervention. We have to have good standardization so it can be replicated. And so we do a better job up front, I think, of documenting what are these changes that we're making there. So the bottom line, orchestrated testing allows us to learn more, less resources, faster than our current approach. What's the downside? It's a real downside. It's much more complex to set up and manage. Okay, so now we're just managing our improvement team, but we're actually being an orchestrated leader that coordinates the work of 8 teams. So organizations that work in a collaborative, like your collaborative here, and lots of other networks around the world, that's the ideal place to accelerate the improvement work to the network level, not just the individual site level there. And then lastly, last idea, we all know about innovation, and we do a lot of that. And we all know about diffusion and spread and scale up. We do a lot of that. Well, Frank Davidhoff wrote a paper called On the Undiffusion of Established Practices, and Maureen Bissanoga in her talks recently, I think she's going to talk at the BMJM Forum this week and talk about these 2 concepts, is to think about just not what more are we going to do, but less are we going to do. How are we going to stop doing some stuff that doesn't work anymore? So what's our improvement project that's working on stopping something that we started 6 years ago that's not working, that we can evaluate and do that? How do we eliminate wasteful practices and processes? So our lean thinking helps us here. How do we establish procedures establish procedures can be hard to abandon even when the evidence is strong, so we have to have a strong framework and effort to actually make this happen. And then it's interesting, the undiffusion curve doesn't follow the same theory of Rogers' diffusion curve. We have a nice F shape. Okay, a lot of times it can be flat, nothing happens, and a lot of times it can be instant, where all of a sudden things disappear through policy and action at the right level of the organization. So make sure that we're thinking about make some of our improvement projects not just innovation, improvement, and spread, but think about, is there room for some exnovation and undiffusion as part of our portfolio of improvement projects? So we got lots to do in so little time, and we got 2 jobs, right? So here's some hints to how we can make sure as we're doing our day job, taking care of patients, that we're also doing our other day job, which is improving our care for patients. Thank you.